The night my son brought his rich friends to my
We're here.
house,
This is the place?
I knew I was
Come in,
being
son.
judged the moment they stepped through my front door. Their eyes traveled across my faded curtains,
Look at these curtains.
my worn kitchen
so
table,
faded.
and the old family
This
photos
table's seen
hanging
better
on the wall,
days.
like they were touring a museum of failure. Then my own son laughed when one of them asked if I had always lived this cheaply. I felt my heart crack silently in my chest. But 3 days later, those same people sat in my kitchen again, except this time they weren't laughing. They were begging me not to ruin their lives. If this story touches your heart, don't forget to like and subscribe. I'd also love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been judged because of your age, your home, or your financial situation? And wherever you're watching from tonight, tell me your city and local time in the comments. Sometimes it's comforting to know we're not alone. My name is Victoria Thomas, and at 62 years old, I had learned how to survive loneliness better than most people survive marriage. I lived in the same small house in Cleveland, Ohio that my husband and I bought 34 years ago, back when our dreams were bigger than our bank account. The paint around the porch had started peeling years ago, and no matter how many times I tried to fix it myself, the harsh Ohio winters always won. The kitchen floor creaked under my slippers every morning, and the pipes rattled whenever I turned on hot water. But it was home. Every corner of that house carried memories. Some beautiful, some painful. After Richard died 8 years earlier, the silence inside those walls became unbearable at first. I remember waking up in the middle of the night, reaching for him only to touch cold sheets. Even now, there were mornings when I still caught myself making 2 cups of coffee before realizing I was alone. People think grief fades with time. It doesn't. It simply changes shape. Most days, I kept myself busy to avoid thinking too much. 3 mornings a week, I worked part-time at the local community library. The pay was small, but I loved being surrounded by books and familiar faces. Children came in after school to finish homework. Elderly men argued about newspapers near the front windows, and lonely women like me lingered in the romance section longer than necessary. At the library, people still smiled at me. That mattered more than money. The rest of my income came from sewing and repairing clothes for neighbors. I had an old Singer machine sitting beside my dining table, and on quiet nights, the sound of the needle moving through fabric kept me company. Sometimes I hemmed dresses for young women preparing for weddings. Sometimes I repaired coats for retired veterans living nearby. I never charged much. Maybe because I understood what it felt like to count every dollar before grocery shopping. Still, I managed. Not comfortably, but honestly. The hardest part of my life was not losing my husband. It was slowly losing my son while he was still alive. Ethan used to be the sweetest little boy. When he was 7, he once cried because another child at school laughed at my old car. He marched right up to that boy and said, "My mom works harder than anybody." I remember holding him tightly that night, feeling proud that I had raised a kind child. But kindness is fragile in certain worlds, especially worlds built on money. Ethan was brilliant growing up. He earned scholarships, graduated near the top of his class, and eventually moved to Chicago to work in finance. I still remember the excitement in his voice during his first week there. "Mom, these buildings are huge. You should see the restaurants here." At first, he called me almost every night, then every weekend, then once a month, then only on holidays. Eventually, even holidays became uncertain. Whenever I asked if he was eating properly, he sounded impatient. Whenever I mentioned Cleveland, he changed the subject quickly, like the city embarrassed him. But I still defended him to everyone. "That boy works hard," I'd tell neighbors. "He's busy building his future." The truth was harder to admit. The higher Ethan climbed, the less he seemed willing to look back at where he came from. I noticed it gradually over the years. His clothes became more expensive. His voice changed slightly, too smooth or colder somehow. He stopped laughing at simple things. When he visited, which was rare, He spent more time on his phone than talking to me. Once, about 3 years earlier, I overheard him speaking to a coworker on speakerphone. "No, I'm not staying long," he said quietly. My mother still lives in the same old neighborhood. Something inside me cracked that day, not because we were poor, but because he sounded ashamed. I never told him how much I sacrificed for him. Children should not carry the weight of their parents' struggles. But maybe that was my mistake. When Ethan got accepted into Northwestern University, I sold almost everything valuable I owned to help him move there. My mother's jewelry, Richard's watch collection, even my wedding pearls. Richard wanted me to keep them. Their family history, he once told me. But what good was history if it couldn't build a future for our son? There were nights I skipped meals after paying Ethan's tuition balance. I remember pretending I wasn't hungry whenever Richard noticed the refrigerator looked empty near the end of the month. We never told Ethan how difficult it truly was. We wanted him focused on his dreams, not our sacrifices. And for a long time, I believed those sacrifices were worth it. Until success turned my son into someone I barely recognized. One snowy Thursday afternoon, I was organizing returned books at the library when my phone buzzed unexpectedly. Ethan. My heart immediately lifted. I stepped into the hallway before answering. "Hi, sweetheart. Hey, Mom." His voice sounded distracted but warmer than usual. "I've been thinking," he said. "Some friends and I might drive down to Cleveland next weekend." I nearly dropped the phone. "Really? Yeah. Just for one night." I smiled so hard my cheeks hurt. "That's wonderful. I can cook dinner?" "I still remember your favorite roast, Mom," he interrupted gently. "Nothing complicated, okay?" I paused. "Oh? Of course, and my friends are kind of important people." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. "They work in investment and development. Big careers." "I understand," I said softly. "So maybe don't bring up embarrassing stories from when I was little." The smile faded from my face. "I wouldn't embarrass you, and maybe wear something a little nicer than usual." I looked down at my cardigan automatically. Silence stretched between us. Then Ethan laughed awkwardly. "I just want things to go smoothly." I swallowed hard. "Of course, sweetheart." After we hung up, I stood alone in the hallway, staring at my reflection in the library window. For the first time in years, I wondered if my son saw me as a burden instead of a mother. But even then, even after the strange conversation, I was still excited to see him. Because that's the terrible thing about a mother's heart. It keeps loving long after it should protect itself. Near closing time, while putting books away, I checked my phone again and noticed Ethan had accidentally left me a voicemail. At first I smiled, then I pressed play and heard my son's voice say quietly to someone beside him, "Just play nice for one evening. Once she signs, this whole thing moves forward." My blood turned cold. I replayed Ethan's voicemail at least 6 times that night. Each time my chest tightened a little more. "Just play nice for one evening. Once she signs, this whole thing moves forward." The sentence echoed through my quiet kitchen long after midnight. I sat alone at the table beneath the yellow glow of the overhead light, staring at my old cell phone like it had suddenly become dangerous. What exactly was I supposed to sign, and why did my son sound nervous? Part of me wanted to call him immediately and demand answers. Another part, the larger part, was afraid of what I might hear if I did. So instead, I convinced myself there had to be some misunderstanding. Maybe it was paperwork for a business proposal. Maybe Ethan was helping his company purchase property nearby. Maybe I was overthinking because loneliness had made me suspicious. That's what mothers do sometimes. We rewrite painful truths into softer lies, just so we can sleep at night. The next morning, Cleveland woke beneath gray skies and freezing rain. I stood by the kitchen window, holding my coffee, while watching water drip from the porch roof. My reflection in the glass looked older than I remembered. The silver in my hair seemed brighter lately, and the faint lines around my mouth had deepened over the years. I suddenly remembered Ethan's words, "Wear something nicer than usual." I looked down at my faded blue cardigan. For a brief moment, embarrassment crawled through me. Then anger followed immediately after. I had spent decades feeding, protecting, and loving that boy. I had cleaned vomit from his bedsheets when he was sick. I had worked extra sewing jobs when he needed textbooks. I had sat awake praying during every snowstorm while he drove home from college. And now I was worried whether my sweater embarrassed him. The realization hurt more than I wanted to admit. Still, despite everything, I spent the next 2 days preparing for his visit. Because love is stubborn, especially a mother's love. Saturday morning, I woke before sunrise and began cleaning the house from top to bottom. I polished the dining table Richard built years ago, even though one leg still leaned slightly to the left. I washed the windows twice. I vacuumed every corner rug until my back ached. Then I went grocery shopping. I carefully counted coupons while pushing my cart through the aisles. Pot roast ingredients, fresh carrots, Ethan's favorite mashed potatoes, apple pie. At the bakery section, I stood staring at a chocolate cake for almost 5 minutes. It cost $38. Too much. But Ethan used to love chocolate cake on special occasions. I bought it anyway. By the time I returned home, my hands were numb from carrying bags through the cold. I placed everything carefully in the kitchen and glanced at the clock. 4 more hours. My stomach twisted with nervous energy. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was only my son visiting. But deep down, I knew this visit felt different. Dangerous somehow. Around noon, I walked upstairs to choose something nicer to wear. The sentence alone humiliated me. I opened my closet slowly and ran my fingers across old blouses and church dresses I rarely used anymore. Eventually, I picked a dark green sweater Richard once said brought out my eyes. I hadn't worn it since his funeral. As I stood in front of the mirror brushing my hair, memories flooded back unexpectedly. Richard smiling at me across crowded diners. Richard dancing with me barefoot in the kitchen. Richard whispering, "Don't ever let this world make you feel small, Victoria." Tears burned my eyes, because lately that was exactly how I felt. Small. At 4:30 that afternoon, Ethan texted me. "Running a little late. Don't stress yourself out." No heart emoji. No love you, Mom. Just businesslike. I stared at the message longer than I should have. By 6 o'clock, snow had started falling outside. The pot roast sat warming in the oven while soft jazz played quietly from the radio. I kept checking the front window every few minutes like a nervous teenager waiting for a first date. Then finally, headlights appeared. Not one car. 3. Luxury SUVs rolled slowly down my street, their polished surfaces reflecting the neighborhood's dim porch lights. Several curtains nearby shifted immediately as neighbors peeked outside. People in my neighborhood noticed vehicles like that. I suddenly became painfully aware of how small my house looked beside them. The first person to step out was Ethan. For a moment, my heart lifted automatically. He looked healthy, expensive wool coat, designer shoes, fresh haircut, successful. But something about him felt distant even before he reached the porch. He hugged me quickly when I opened the door. "Hey, Mom." I held on to him a little longer than he held on to me. "It's so good to see you." "Yeah," he said distractedly, glancing over his shoulder. Then the others approached. The tall blonde man walking beside Ethan smiled first. Except it wasn't warmth. It was inspection. "Mrs. Thomas?" he said smoothly. "I'm Logan Whitmore. His handshake felt cold and practiced. Behind him stood a striking brunette woman in an expensive cream-colored coat. Vanessa Carter. Perfect makeup. Perfect posture. The kind of woman who probably never worried about grocery prices in her life. And finally, Derek Lawson, carrying himself with the polished confidence of someone used to winning arguments. Their eyes moved through my doorway immediately, noticing everything. The old wallpaper, the narrow hallway, the outdated light fixtures. I saw it happen in seconds. Judgment. Vanessa smiled tightly. "Oh my goodness," she said. "This place feels so authentic." I forced a polite smile. "Thank you." Logan stepped inside and glanced toward the living room. "Wow," he murmured. "You really kept everything original, huh?" Ethan laughed under his breath. "Trust me, she hates changing things." The comment sounded harmless, but something inside me sank anyway. As they removed their coats, I noticed Derek studying the framed family photos along the wall. His attention lingered strangely on the picture of Richard standing in front of our house 20 years earlier. Interesting, I thought. Very interesting. Meanwhile, Vanessa wandered toward the dining room. "This table is adorable," she said. "It's like one of those vintage farmhouse restaurants." I knew an insult disguised as admiration when I heard one. Still, I stayed calm. "Dinner's almost ready," I said gently. Ethan checked his watch immediately. "Good. We can eat quickly." Quickly. Like visiting me was another appointment squeezed between more important things. While I served drinks in the kitchen, I overheard Logan speaking quietly near the front door. "You weren't kidding," he muttered. Then Ethan replied softly enough that he probably thought I couldn't hear. "Just be respectful until we handle the paperwork." Paperwork. There it was again. My hands froze around the tray, and for the first time since my son arrived, I stopped feeling excited. I started feeling afraid. Dinner should have felt warm. Instead, it felt like an interview I was already failing. The moment everyone settled into the dining room, I noticed how uncomfortable my home suddenly seemed through their eyes. Logan sat at the head of the table, like he belonged there more than I did. Vanessa carefully placed her designer purse on the chair beside her, avoiding contact with the floor. Derek loosened his expensive watch slightly before glancing around the room with quiet calculation. And Ethan? My son barely looked at me at all. I carried the pot roast to the center of the table, forcing a smile onto my face. "I hope everyone's hungry." Logan leaned back slightly and looked around the dining room. "This is honestly fascinating," he said. I blinked. "Fascinating." "Yeah?" he replied casually. "Places like this don't really exist in Chicago anymore." Vanessa laughed softly into her wine glass. "It feels almost cinematic." I knew they thought they were being subtle, but wealthy people often mistake cruelty for sophistication. Ethan reached for the mashed potatoes quickly. "My mom's old-fashioned," he said with a shrug. "She refuses to modernize anything." The comment hit harder than it should have. Because once upon a time, Ethan loved this house. He used to build blanket forts in the living room. He used to sit on this exact floor coloring Christmas ornaments beside Richard. He once told me our house smelled safer than anywhere else in the world. Now, he spoke about it like an embarrassing relic. Vanessa glanced toward the old family photos hanging on the wall nearby. "That your husband?" she asked. I followed her gaze toward Richard's picture. "Yes." For the first time all evening, warmth touched my voice naturally. "He passed away 8 years ago." "Oh," she said politely. "What did he do?" Before I could answer, Ethan spoke first. "He was a lawyer." Logan raised an eyebrow, a successful one. Something inside me tightened immediately. Richard had always hated people who measured human worth by money. He helped families dealing with fraud and housing issues, I answered calmly. Derek suddenly seemed more interested. What kind of housing issues? I noticed Ethan glance at him quickly. Dad mostly handled small local cases, Ethan interrupted. Nothing major. It was strange. Too fast. Like he didn't want me talking too much. I quietly served everyone another portion of food while trying not to show my discomfort. But then Logan looked around again and smirked slightly. So, Mrs. Thomas, he said, have you lived here your whole life, most of it, and the neighborhood never bothered you? I frowned slightly. What do you mean? He gestured vaguely toward the street outside. It's just modest. The word lingered in the air like an insult dressed in expensive clothing. Ethan chuckled awkwardly. Logan grew up in private gated communities. Clearly, I replied softly. For a brief second, Logan looked surprised by the sharpness in my tone. But then, Vanessa smiled brightly and changed the subject. So, Ethan tells us you work at a library? Yes. That's sweet. Sweet. Not respectable. Not admirable. Sweet. I suddenly felt very tired. Yes, I said quietly. I enjoy it. Vanessa tilted her head sympathetically. I imagine retirement must be difficult nowadays. Everything's so expensive. There it was again. That assumption. Poor old widow barely surviving. I looked down at my plate for a moment before answering. I've learned that people can survive with less than they think. Logan laughed. That's one way to look at it. Ethan smiled weakly beside him, eager for approval. I watched my son carefully then. Every laugh, every nervous glance, every moment he chose their comfort over my dignity. And slowly, a terrible realization settled over me. Ethan wasn't uncomfortable because his friends were rude. He was uncomfortable because he feared I might expose where he truly came from. Derek suddenly pointed toward the kitchen doorway. Beautiful woodwork in this place, he commented. Houses this old usually sit on valuable land. My heartbeat slowed. There it was again. Interest in the property. Not me. Not family. The house, I answered carefully. My husband built most of it himself. Derek nodded thoughtfully. You own the full property, Ethan immediately jumped in. It's nothing special, he said quickly, but Derek ignored him. How large is the lot? I set down my fork slowly. Why are you asking? The room grew quiet for half a second. Then Logan laughed casually. Derek's always thinking like a lawyer. Ignore him. But I didn't ignore him, because now I was paying attention. Real attention. Vanessa took a sip of wine and smiled toward Ethan. You must have worked incredibly hard to rise above all this. All this. Not this home, not this family. This, like my entire life, was something beneath them. I saw Ethan hesitate, just briefly, and for one hopeful second, I thought maybe he would finally defend me. Instead, he laughed softly. You have no idea. The words sliced through me. I felt heat rush into my face, but I refused to cry in front of them. Not for their entertainment. I stood slowly. Would anyone like more roast? Nobody answered immediately. Then Logan spoke while scrolling through his phone. Actually, Mrs. Thomas, can I ask something? I nodded carefully. How much do homes around here even cost? Ethan sighed. Logan? No, seriously, Logan continued. Chicago prices completely ruin your perspective. I folded my hands together. I've never planned to sell. That's not what I asked. The arrogance in his voice stunned me. Vanessa leaned toward him slightly. Logan, but he kept going. I'm just saying, there's probably more value in the land than the actual house. Derek quietly exchanged a glance with Ethan, and suddenly the room felt colder. I forced myself to remain calm. My husband and I built our life here, I said softly. Not everything is about resale value. Logan smirked faintly. For most successful people it is. The silence afterward felt unbearable. Then Ethan muttered something that hurt more than everything else combined. Well, Mom's always been sentimental instead of practical. Sentimental instead of practical. I stared at my son in disbelief. Did he know what it took to raise him? Did he know how many nights Richard and I sat awake, terrified about bills? Did he know I skipped meals during his freshman year so he wouldn't have to leave school? Practical? The word echoed bitterly inside me. Without another sentence, I stood and walked into the kitchen carrying empty plates. My hands trembled slightly as I gripped the edge of the counter. From the dining room, I could still hear their voices. Low, careful, businesslike. Then I heard it, the sentence that changed everything. Logan spoke first. If she signs before the zoning review, we're clear. Derek answered quietly. Only if there aren't surviving records connected to the original investigation. My entire body froze. Original investigation. Then Ethan's voice followed. My father's been dead for years. There's nothing left. I stopped breathing for a moment, because suddenly I remembered a name, a file. A warning Richard gave me almost 10 years earlier. Lake Horizon redevelopment project. My stomach dropped. That was the project they were talking about, and Richard once told me it was dangerous enough to destroy powerful people. I barely slept after they left that night. The house felt contaminated somehow. Their laughter still echoed through the walls long after the front door closed behind them. I cleaned the kitchen in silence near midnight, slowly washing dishes while replaying every word I had overheard. If she signs before the zoning review, we're clear. My father's been dead for years. There's nothing left. Nothing left. Ethan had said it so casually, as if Richard's entire life had disappeared into dust. As if the man who worked himself into exhaustion trying to protect ordinary families meant absolutely nothing now. I dried my hands carefully and stared toward the dark hallway leading to the basement door. Because deep down, I knew Ethan was wrong. There was something left. Richard never trusted powerful people, especially wealthy developers hiding behind charitable investment projects. 10 years earlier, during one particularly stressful winter, Richard spent months obsessing over a redevelopment case connected to Lake Horizon. I remembered waking up at 3 a.m. and finding him sitting alone at the dining table surrounded by files and legal documents. He looked exhausted back then, afraid even. I had asked him once why the case mattered so much, and I still remembered his answer perfectly. Because people with money think they can erase poor communities and nobody will fight back. At the time, I didn't fully understand how dangerous the situation truly was. But now those same people had walked directly into my home, and somehow Ethan was involved with them. The next morning, snow covered the street outside in soft, white silence. I sat at the kitchen table holding coffee that had long gone cold while staring at Richard's photograph on the wall. "What did you leave behind?" I whispered softly. My eyes drifted again toward the basement door. I hadn't gone through Richard's old legal storage in years. After his death, I packed everything into boxes because looking at his unfinished work hurt too much. Sometimes grief doesn't let you sort through memories properly. It simply teaches you how to avoid them. But avoidance suddenly felt dangerous. Around 9 o'clock, my phone buzzed. Ethan. For a moment, I considered ignoring the call. Instead, I answered quietly. "Hello? Hey, Mom?" His voice sounded rushed. About last night. I waited. You weren't upset, were you? The question almost made me laugh. Upset. Such a small word for humiliation. I'm fine, I lied. Good, he said quickly, relieved. Logan actually really liked you. I closed my eyes slowly. That's kind of him. And listen. The guys might stop by again before heading back to Chicago. There are some documents we may need you to look over. There it was, finally said out loud. What kind of documents? A brief pause. Just property-related stuff. Related to my house? It's complicated. No, I said softly. It's probably very simple. Another silence. Then Ethan sighed impatiently. Mom, don't start overthinking this. Overthinking. That word people use when they don't want you asking questions. I'll talk to you later, I replied quietly before hanging up. My hands were trembling again. For several long minutes, I sat frozen in my chair, listening to the ticking kitchen clock. Then finally, slowly, I stood and walked toward the basement. The wooden stairs creaked beneath my feet as I descended into the cold darkness below the house. The air smelled faintly of dust, old paper, and machine oil from Richard's forgotten tools. Memories hit me immediately. Christmas decorations stacked near the wall. Ethan's old baseball glove, Richard's winter coats still hanging exactly where he left them. I nearly turned around, but then I saw the filing cabinet in the far corner. Gray metal. Locked. Forgotten. My chest tightened painfully. Richard used to spend hours beside that cabinet late at night. Sometimes he'd close it quickly whenever Ethan entered the basement unexpectedly. At the time, I assumed he was simply protecting confidential client information. Now, I wasn't so sure. I searched through an old toolbox until I found the spare key taped underneath a drawer exactly where Richard always hid important things. Some habits never change. The cabinet opened with a loud metallic click. Inside were dozens of folders arranged alphabetically. Most involved ordinary legal cases, foreclosures, tenant disputes, insurance fraud. Then, finally, near the back, I found a thick brown file labeled Lake Horizon Redevelopment Project. My pulse immediately quickened. I carried the folder upstairs carefully like it contained explosives. In many ways, maybe it did. The file was enormous. Contracts, land surveys, financial reports, photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes in Richard's familiar messy script. I sat at the dining table for nearly 2 hours reading everything. By noon, my hands had gone cold, because the deeper I read, the more horrifying the truth became. Lake Horizon had originally been presented as an affordable housing initiative designed to help struggling neighborhoods in Cleveland. Publicly, investors promised parks, schools, and economic growth. Privately, according to Richard's notes, several executives planned to manipulate zoning laws, force residents out cheaply, and secretly redirect millions through shell companies. Families would lose homes. Entire neighborhoods would disappear. And the people responsible would become richer than ever. Richard had spent years gathering evidence. Then suddenly, he stopped. Near the bottom of the file, I found one handwritten note underlined twice. Whitmore Holdings connected through intermediary accounts. Whitmore. My stomach dropped instantly. Logan Whitmore, his father. I leaned back slowly, feeling physically sick. No wonder Logan was interested in my property. No wonder Derek kept asking about ownership. No wonder Ethan sounded desperate. This wasn't some harmless business deal. This was something far uglier. And somehow, my home sat directly in the middle of it. Then I found another document. A property map. My eyes scanned it carefully before landing on a highlighted section outlined in red. My house, or more specifically, the land beneath my house. Attached beside the map was one final note from Richard. Critical parcel ownership unresolved. Without signature transfer, redevelopment approval may collapse. My entire body went numb. They needed my signature because legally the project couldn't move forward without this property. That's why Ethan came home. Not because he missed me. Not because he loved me. Because they needed something. A sound outside startled me suddenly. Car doors. Voices. I quickly closed the file and looked through the window. A black SUV had parked outside my house again. And standing beside it was Ethan. With Logan. My heart immediately began pounding. I watched as Logan adjusted his expensive coat and smiled confidently toward my front door. Like a man arriving to collect something he already owned. Then Ethan looked up toward the house. For one brief second, guilt crossed his face, but it vanished quickly. A moment later, they walked toward my porch, carrying leather folders in their hands, and I realized something terrifying. My son hadn't brought those people into my home to mock me by accident. He brought them because they believed I was weak enough to manipulate. I hid Richard's file beneath a stack of old cookbooks just seconds before the knock came at the front door. My pulse thundered inside my chest. Outside the living room window, snow continued falling softly across the street, covering the neighborhood in deceptive peace. But inside my house, something dangerous had already begun unfolding. I opened the door slowly. Ethan stood there first, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Hey, Mom." Behind him, Logan Whitmore looked perfectly composed in a charcoal wool coat that probably cost more than my monthly income. Unlike the night before, there was no fake friendliness in his expression now. Only focus. Business. "Mrs. Thomas," he said smoothly. "Sorry to bother you again." "You're already here," I replied quietly. For a split second, surprise flickered across his face. Maybe he wasn't used to people answering him without nervousness. Ethan stepped inside, quickly rubbing his hands together from the cold. "We won't stay long." "That depends," I said softly. He frowned slightly. I led them into the dining room, where yesterday's humiliation still lingered in my memory, like a stain on the walls. Logan placed a leather folder carefully onto the table, while Ethan avoided eye contact completely. My son looked exhausted, not physically, morally. Logan opened the folder immediately. So he began. "We're finalizing several redevelopment acquisitions connected to the Lake Horizon expansion." I watched him carefully without speaking. He continued smoothly, practiced and confident. "Your property happens to sit adjacent to a highly strategic section of land." Adjacent. Such a clean corporate word for someone's home. "I see," I answered. Logan smiled. "We're offering extremely generous compensation." He slid several papers toward me. I didn't touch them. Ethan finally spoke. "Mom, this could really help you. Help me." The words almost made me angry enough to laugh. "You mean help your project?" Silence. Logan recovered first. Well, naturally, both parties benefit. I leaned back slowly in my chair. And if I refuse, Ethan sighed heavily. "Mom?" "No," I interrupted gently. "I'd like to hear Mr. Whitmore answer." For the first time, Logan's smile weakened slightly. "I think refusing would be financially unwise." There it was. The threat beneath the politeness. Not loud, not direct, but very real. I folded my hands together calmly. "My husband used to say people reveal themselves fastest when money is involved." Ethan immediately stiffened. "Mom, this doesn't have to become emotional." I stared at him. Doesn't have to become emotional? As though they weren't sitting in the home where I raised him. As though this house wasn't filled with decades of sacrifice. Logan glanced toward the hallway photographs again. "You mentioned your husband worked legal cases," he said carefully. Mostly small local matters. I noticed how casually he asked it. Too casually. He worked very hard, I answered. That's not what I asked. Something cold settled inside me then. These people weren't merely greedy, they were afraid. And suddenly I realized I was no longer the weakest person in the room. I looked directly at Logan. You seem very interested in my late husband. For the first time since arriving, Logan hesitated, only briefly. Then Ethan jumped in again. Mom, nobody's interrogating you. No, I replied quietly. I think someone is. The room fell silent. Outside, wind rattled softly against the windows. Finally, Logan leaned back in his chair and smiled again, though this time the warmth looked forced. I respect intelligent people, Mrs. Thomas, that's all. Richard used to smile the exact same way whenever opposing attorneys lied in court. Polite mouths, dangerous eyes. I looked down at the paperwork for the first time. Purchase agreements, transfer clauses, confidentiality conditions. The amount offered initially looked large enough to shock someone in my financial position. But after seeing Richard's files, I understood immediately. The land was worth far more. Far, far more. And they were desperate to secure it quickly. I turned a page slowly, then another. Then I stopped. What's this? Derek Lawson's name appeared in the legal preparation section. Interesting. Very interesting. Logan answered carefully. Standard legal processing. Why does the agreement require accelerated approval before zoning review? Both men froze, almost invisibly. But I noticed, because Richard trained me years ago to notice small reactions. Ethan looked at Logan immediately. Logan's voice remained calm. It simplifies the timeline. No, I said softly. It protects the investors. Silence crashed heavily into the room. Ethan stared at me now, like he was seeing a stranger. Probably because for the first time in years, I wasn't acting like the quiet, harmless mother he assumed I was. Logan closed the folder slowly. You've looked into the project. I held his gaze. My husband did. The temperature in the room seemed to change instantly. Ethan stood abruptly. Mom, enough. No, I replied firmly. Not enough. He looked stunned by my tone. Because mothers like me are expected to stay soft forever? Even when disrespected? Even when betrayed? Especially when betrayed by our own children. I rose slowly from my chair and walked toward the living room window. Snow continued falling outside, peaceful and indifferent. You know, I said quietly, Richard stopped sleeping near the end of his life. Nobody spoke. He became obsessed with certain financial documents, certain developers. Behind me, I heard Logan shift slightly. He believed powerful people were trying to destroy neighborhoods for profit. Ethan's voice suddenly sharpened. Mom, I turned around slowly. What exactly did you tell these people about your father? His face paled immediately. That's not fair. Isn't it? Logan stood carefully. Mrs. Thomas? I think there's been some misunderstanding. No, I interrupted softly. I think there's been lying. The room went completely still. For a long moment, nobody moved. Then finally, Ethan exploded. You don't understand how this world works? The sudden anger startled even Logan. Ethan pointed around the house furiously. This place, this life, you think I wanted this forever? Pain punched through my chest. Ethan, no, he snapped. Do you know what it's like sitting beside people who grew up with everything while your mother patches sweaters for neighbors? The words hit harder than shouting, because shame spoken honestly cuts deepest. I worked my entire life to escape this, he continued bitterly. To become somebody. And humiliating me helps that I whispered. His expression flickered. Guilt, only for a second. Then pride swallowed it again. You don't get it. No, I said quietly. I finally do. Silence stretched painfully between us. Then Logan spoke carefully. Ethan, maybe we should go. But Ethan wasn't listening anymore. His emotions had finally broken loose after years of hiding them beneath expensive suits and ambition. You know what the problem is? He said bitterly. You and Dad were always satisfied surviving. I want more than survival. My eyes filled despite myself. Richard worked himself sick giving Ethan opportunities, and somehow our sacrifices became sources of embarrassment instead of love. I swallowed hard. Your father was an honorable man. Ethan laughed sharply. He died broke. The sentence shattered something inside me. Completely. I stared at my son in silence, unable to breathe properly for several seconds. Then finally, quietly, I answered, No, Ethan. I looked directly into his eyes. Your father died trying to protect people from men exactly like these. And suddenly, for the first time since entering my house, Logan Whitmore looked genuinely nervous. The silence after my words felt unbearable. Even the wind outside seemed to stop. Logan Whitmore stood perfectly still near the dining table, one hand resting lightly on the leather folder, while his calm expression slowly tightened around the edges. Ethan stared at me with disbelief, like he couldn't understand how the quiet woman who spent her evenings sewing curtains had suddenly become someone dangerous. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Ethan laughed bitterly. You're being dramatic. I looked at my son carefully. No, I answered softly. I think I've been blind. His jaw tightened immediately. Mom, this is exactly why I didn't want to bring work into this house. Work. That word again. As if manipulating his mother into signing legal documents was normal business behavior. Logan finally stepped forward smoothly. Mrs. Thomas? He said carefully. I think emotions are clouding this situation. No, I replied. Emotions are finally clarifying it. Ethan groaned under his breath and ran a hand through his hair. You don't understand how investment projects work, and you don't understand your father at all anymore. That hit him. I saw it immediately in his eyes. Pain, anger, shame. But instead of softening him, it made him crueler. You always do this, he snapped. You turned Dad into some kind of saint. I stared at him in disbelief. Your father gave everything for this family. And what did it get him? Ethan fired back. Stress debt. A tiny house in a dying neighborhood. Every sentence felt like another crack splitting through my chest. Logan glanced between us uneasily now. Even he seemed uncomfortable hearing the argument become so personal. But Ethan wasn't stopping. You know what it was like growing up around kids with money, he continued bitterly. You know what it feels like being the scholarship kid wearing secondhand clothes. I swallowed hard. Because, yes, I did know. I remembered every moment. I remembered pretending not to notice when Ethan avoided inviting friends over during high school. I remembered overhearing him ask Richard to park farther from school because our old car embarrassed him. I remembered finding catalog pages of expensive sneakers hidden beneath his mattress. Back then, I thought those were ordinary teenage insecurities. I didn't realize shame had already rooted itself deep inside him. We did the best we could, I whispered. That's the problem, Ethan shot back. Your best was never enough. The words hit harder than any slap ever could. For a moment, I physically lost my breath. Not because I believed him, but because I suddenly realized he had probably carried that resentment for years. All those quiet phone calls, all those missed holidays, all that distance. It hadn't happened by accident. My son had slowly been pulling away from me because he hated where he came from. I looked toward Richard's photograph hanging near the hallway. My husband used to warn me about this. Poverty doesn't only hurt financially, he once told me. Sometimes it teaches people to hate themselves. At the time, I didn't fully understand. Now I did. Logan cleared his throat carefully. "Ethan," he said quietly, "maybe we should discuss this later." But Ethan ignored him completely. "No," he said sharply. "I'm tired of pretending." He looked directly at me. "You know how humiliating it was bringing people here tonight." The sentence sliced through me so deeply I almost couldn't stand upright. Humiliating. Not painful for him. Not emotional. Humiliating. I folded my arms tightly across my chest, trying to stop my hands from shaking. "You were ashamed of me." Ethan looked away immediately. That silence answered everything. I nodded slowly. "Thank you for finally being honest." "Mom." "No," I interrupted softly. "You already said enough." For the first time all evening, guilt began breaking visibly across his face. But before he could speak again, Logan stepped forward quickly. "We're getting off track," he said calmly. "This isn't about family conflict." I turned toward him immediately. "Yes, it is." His expression hardened slightly. "No. This is a business opportunity." "There's no difference anymore," I replied, because now I understood the truth completely. They hadn't chosen Ethan randomly. They chose him because shame makes people easy to manipulate. A young man desperate to escape his background, desperate to belong beside wealthy people, desperate enough to betray his own mother. Logan softened his tone carefully. "Mrs. Thomas, nobody is trying to hurt you." I almost laughed. "You brought strangers into my home to pressure me into signing away property tied to my late husband's investigation." The room froze again. Ethan stared at me sharply. "What investigation?" I immediately realized my mistake. Too much truth too quickly. Logan recovered faster than anyone. "There was no investigation," he said smoothly. "Your mother's confused." But Ethan was looking at me now with growing uncertainty. "What are you talking about?" I hesitated. Because Richard protected Ethan from the ugliness of his legal work intentionally. He never wanted our son carrying fear or danger into adulthood. But maybe that protection had become another mistake. "Your father believed Lake Horizon was corrupt," I said carefully. Logan instantly interrupted. "That's absurd, is it?" I asked quietly. His eyes sharpened. "You have no proof. Not you're wrong. No proof. Important difference." Ethan noticed it too. I saw confusion begin spreading across his face. Logan sighed dramatically, the performance almost impressive. "Large projects attract accusations all the time. Your father probably misunderstood financial structures." But I remembered Richard sitting awake night after night, terrified and exhausted. I remembered confidential phone calls, locked cabinets, hidden files. Richard was many things, but careless wasn't one of them. "You knew my father," Ethan suddenly asked Logan. "No." "Then how do you know he misunderstood anything?" That question shifted the atmosphere instantly. For the first time since entering my house, Logan looked genuinely irritated. Because control was slipping. Derek wasn't there this time. Vanessa wasn't there. And Ethan was no longer blindly following. Logan straightened slowly. "I think we should leave." But Ethan stepped in front of him. "No." The single word stunned everyone, including me. Ethan looked pale now, his breathing uneven. "You said this project was clean." "It is." "Then why are you panicking?" "I'm not panicking. You just tried to shut down every conversation about my father." The tension inside the room became suffocating. I remained silent carefully, because finally, Ethan was asking the right questions. Logan's polished mask began cracking around the edges. "You're emotional right now," he said coldly. "That's understandable considering your background." Your background. There it was again, that same poison, the belief that money determines human value. And suddenly, Ethan flinched visibly at the phrase, because maybe for the first time, he realized Logan included him in that judgment too. Logan continued calmly. "You wanted success, Ethan. This is what success requires." I watched my son's face carefully then, and I saw it happen. The moment doubt entered him. The moment he began realizing these people never truly respected him, only his usefulness. Slowly, Ethan turned toward me. "Mom," he whispered weakly. I should have felt victorious. Instead, I only felt tired, deeply tired, because nothing hurts a mother more than watching her child lose his soul piece by piece. I looked at Ethan quietly. "I warned you last night." He lowered his eyes. Then Logan grabbed the folder sharply from the table. "This conversation is over." His politeness was completely gone now. Cold anger replaced it. He walked toward the front door quickly before stopping beside Ethan one final time. "You need to decide which life you want," he said quietly. Then he glanced briefly around my house. "Because this one already buried your father." The front door slammed moments later. Silence swallowed the room. And for the first time since Ethan arrived in Cleveland, he looked afraid too. After Logan left, the house became painfully quiet. The kind of silence that presses against your chest until breathing feels difficult. Ethan stood near the dining table, with both hands braced against the wood, staring downward, like he was trying to process everything at once. Snow continued drifting past the windows outside, soft and slow, covering the neighborhood in white, while inside my home, decades of trust were collapsing between mother and son. I watched him carefully. For the first time in years, Ethan looked less like a successful finance executive and more like the frightened little boy who used to hide behind Richard during thunderstorms. But fear alone doesn't erase betrayal. "You lied to me," I said quietly. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Mom, you brought those people here to pressure me. It wasn't supposed to happen like this." I almost smiled at the absurdity of the sentence. People always say that after hurting someone, as if pain becomes smaller when the cruelty was poorly planned. I crossed my arms tightly. Then how was it supposed to happen? He finally looked at me, and for a moment, I saw shame written clearly across his face. "You were supposed to trust me." The answer stunned me. Not because it was manipulative, because part of him genuinely believed it. "You expected me to sign documents without understanding them." "No," he snapped defensively. "I expected you to believe I wouldn't hurt you." The words hung heavily in the air. I stared at my son for several seconds before answering softly. "But you already did." His face fell immediately. For a brief moment, neither of us spoke. Then Ethan sank into one of the dining chairs and rubbed both hands over his face. "You don't understand how much pressure I'm under." Pressure. Another excuse. But this one sounded more honest. I sat across from him slowly. "Then explain it to me." He hesitated. I could see the internal battle happening behind his eyes, the desire to protect himself fighting against the growing realization that the people around him might not actually care about him at all. Finally, his shoulders sagged. "Lake Horizon is supposed to be the biggest redevelopment project in the Midwest," he admitted quietly. "Billions of dollars." I remained silent, Logan's father has connections everywhere. Investors, politicians, banks. Ethan swallowed hard. Everyone wants in. And what does that have to do with my house? He looked away. There's a zoning problem. I already knew that. Still, hearing him admit it hurt differently. The project boundaries can't fully pass through city approval unless certain surrounding properties are voluntarily transferred. Mine included. Yes. Silence settled again. Then I asked the question that mattered most. And you knew this before coming here. He nodded slowly. The movement was small, but it shattered something inside me permanently. Because now there was no misunderstanding left. No confusion. My son planned this. He came home pretending to reconnect with me, while secretly hoping to manipulate me into surrendering my property. I stared toward the family photos hanging near the hallway. Richard, holding Ethan at age 5. Ethan graduating college. Christmas mornings, birthdays, 33 years of motherhood, and somehow we ended up here. You used me, I whispered. Ethan immediately shook his head. No, Mom, it wasn't like that. Then tell me what it was like. He stood suddenly, frustration flashing across his face. You think life is simple because you stayed here? The words struck hard. You think integrity pays bills? You think honesty gets people ahead anymore? His voice echoed through the room now. I spent years watching wealthy people succeed, while men like Dad worked themselves to death and still struggled. I rose slowly too. Your father struggled because he refused to become corrupt, and where did that leave him? Ethan shot back bitterly. Dead before retirement. The cruelty of the sentence stunned even him. I saw immediate regret cross his expression, but it was too late. Pain flooded through me so sharply I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. Don't, I whispered. Ethan looked horrified suddenly. Mom, I didn't mean... Yes, I interrupted softly. You did. The room fell silent again. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Not now. Not while fighting for the last pieces of dignity I had left. Ethan looked exhausted suddenly. Smaller somehow. I just wanted more, he said quietly. There it was. The real truth beneath everything. Not greed alone. Not evil. Hunger. A desperate need to escape the shame he carried from childhood. And maybe that was the cruelest part of all. Because Richard and I sacrificed our entire lives trying to give Ethan opportunities we never had. But instead of feeling grateful, he learned to resent the very struggle that created him. I walked slowly toward the kitchen sink, staring out into the snowy darkness. When you were 12, I said quietly, you asked your father why we didn't live in a bigger house. Ethan didn't answer. He told you something I never forgot. I turned toward him. He said, a small, honest home is worth more than a mansion built on ruined lives. Ethan lowered his eyes immediately, because he remembered. Of course he remembered. Richard had been Ethan's hero once, before ambition replaced admiration. Then suddenly, Ethan's phone buzzed loudly against the table. The sound startled both of us. He glanced at the screen. Logan. Ethan hesitated, then answered. Yeah, I watched his face carefully as Logan spoke rapidly on the other end. At first, Ethan looked defensive, then confused, then pale. What do you mean they're reviewing the records? He asked sharply. A pause. No, that's impossible. Another pause. Ethan's expression darkened further. You told me everything connected to the original investigation was gone. My heartbeat slowed dangerously. Original investigation. Richard, the files. Ethan turned away, slightly lowering his voice. What do you mean if this leaks were exposed? Exposed. Not inconvenienced. Not delayed. Exposed. I noticed his hand trembling faintly around the phone. Then suddenly, his voice hardened. No. Don't put this on me. Silence. His breathing became uneven. You said my mother would sign immediately? I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. The truth stripped bare. Not family, not love, not reconciliation. They truly believed I was just an old widow easy enough to manipulate. Ethan listened another few seconds before speaking quietly. No. I'm not sure anymore. Then he hung up. The room felt colder afterward. Slowly, Ethan looked toward me. And for the first time since arriving in Cleveland, he looked genuinely lost. They're panicking, he admitted quietly. I said nothing. He swallowed hard. There are records somewhere they thought were destroyed. I held his gaze carefully, and if those records surface, his face drained of color. The entire project could collapse. The words settled heavily between us. Then finally, softly, I asked the question he had avoided since the beginning. Ethan, what exactly did you get yourself involved in? He looked at me with fear in his eyes. Real fear this time. And when he answered, his voice barely sounded human anymore. I think I made the biggest mistake of my life. For the first time since Ethan arrived home, I saw something stronger than arrogance in his eyes. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of the people he chose over his family. The realization settled heavily over the room like smoke after a fire. Ethan sat back down slowly at the dining table, both elbows resting on the wood, while his hands covered part of his face. The confidence he carried into my house only hours earlier had completely disappeared. He looked exhausted now, like a man realizing too late that the ladder he climbed was leaning against the wrong wall. I didn't know it was this serious, he whispered. I remained standing near the kitchen window, arms folded tightly across my chest. How serious did you think corruption involving billions of dollars would be? He winced. The question wasn't cruel, just honest. Outside, the snowstorm had grown heavier. Wind pushed against the windows while darkness settled across the neighborhood. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked briefly before everything returned to silence again. Ethan stared blankly at the floor. At first, it looked legitimate, he said quietly. Urban redevelopment, new businesses, affordable housing. And then, he swallowed hard. Then things stopped making sense. I listened carefully. Properties were being acquired too aggressively. Residents were pressured into selling. Certain zoning approvals moved through faster than legally possible. He rubbed his forehead. But by then, I was already involved financially. I felt cold all over. How involved, he hesitated too long. My stomach tightened immediately. Ethan, I signed investment authorizations. The words dropped heavily into the room. I closed my eyes briefly. Richard once told me greed rarely begins with evil intentions. Most people don't wake up planning to destroy lives. They simply keep compromising one small piece of themselves at a time until they no longer recognize who they became. And now, my son stood directly in the middle of that truth. Did you know families would lose their homes? I asked softly. His silence answered me before his voice did. I tried not to think about it. The sentence hurt almost as much as everything else, because ignoring suffering is often easier than causing it intentionally. I walked slowly toward the hallway where Richard's photograph hung beneath the staircase. He looked so alive in that picture. Warm eyes, tired smile. The same smile Ethan used to have before ambition hardened him. He warned us about people like this, I whispered. Ethan looked up at the photograph too. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then finally, he asked quietly, "What exactly did Dad find?" I hesitated, partly because I wasn't sure how much truth to reveal, but also because saying it aloud would make everything undeniably real. I walked into the living room and reached beneath the sofa cushion where I had hidden one section of Richard's files earlier. When I returned to the dining table holding the folder, Ethan's expression changed instantly. Shock. "You actually have records your father kept copies of everything important." His face drained of color. Oh my God. I opened the folder carefully. Inside were financial transfers, shell company structures, property acquisition records, and handwritten notes connecting Whitmore Holdings to hidden development accounts. Richard had spent years documenting patterns of fraud connected to Lake Horizon. And now, those documents sat directly between me and my son. Ethan flipped through several pages, quickly breathing harder with every document. "These account numbers," he whispered. "They're still active." I watched him carefully. "You recognize them?" He nodded slowly. "Some of these companies are still involved in the project." A chill spread through me immediately. That meant Richard's evidence wasn't old history. It was current, alive, dangerous. Ethan suddenly looked terrified. "Mom, if these records become public, the project collapses." He looked at me sharply. "No, people go to prison." Silence swallowed the room. Then another realization hit him. "Wait." His eyes narrowed toward the folder. "How long have you had these since your father died? And you never told anyone I didn't even fully understand what I had until recently?" That part was true. Richard protected me from many details intentionally. He believed the less I knew, the safer I would be. Maybe he was right, because now I finally understood why he became paranoid near the end of his life. Why he checked locks repeatedly. Why strange cars occasionally parked outside our street late at night. Why he once made me promise never to throw away his files, no matter what happened. At the time, I thought grief and stress were exhausting him. Now I wondered if he had been frightened all along. Ethan leaned back heavily in his chair. "You can't show these to anyone." I stared at him in disbelief. "Excuse me? You don't understand who's involved." Anger finally sparked inside me. "No, Ethan, you don't understand." I pointed toward the documents. "Your father spent years trying to stop people from destroying innocent families. You could get hurt. And what about the people already hurt?" His jaw tightened. "This isn't simple. It never was." He stood abruptly and paced toward the kitchen. I could see panic building inside him now, fast and ugly. If Logan finds out these records still exist, he already suspects. Ethan froze. "What?" I nodded slowly. That's why he became nervous tonight. He cursed quietly under his breath. Then his phone buzzed again. This time, he didn't answer immediately. The screen lit up with multiple incoming messages. Logan Whitmore, Derek Lawson, Vanessa Carter. One after another. Relentless. Like wolves circling something wounded. Ethan stared at the phone for several seconds before finally silencing it completely. "I think they're trying to protect themselves now," he admitted. A painful laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "Of course they are." He looked ashamed immediately. "You were right about them." "No," I said softly. "Your father was?" That sentence seemed to hit him harder than anything else, because for the first time Ethan was beginning to understand the difference between wealth and character, and realizing too late that they aren't the same thing. He sat down again slowly. "What are you going to do?" The question lingered heavily between us. Truthfully, I didn't know yet. Part of me wanted to burn every file and pretend none of this existed. I was 62 years old. I worked at a library. I repaired sweaters for neighbors. I wasn't built for legal wars against billionaires. But another part of me, the part Richard loved most, couldn't ignore injustice once it stood directly in front of me. I looked at the folder quietly. These documents matter. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face. "You have no idea how powerful Logan's family is. Powerful people still fear evidence." He looked at me carefully then, and slowly, painfully, realization spread across his expression. That was the moment he finally understood something important. I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Logan, not of wealth, not even of losing my son. Because betrayal changes people, especially mothers who spent too many years staying silent. Then suddenly, headlights flashed across the front windows. Both Ethan and I turned immediately. A black sedan had parked outside my house. Not Logan's SUV, different, older. Someone stepped out wearing a dark coat and carrying a leather briefcase. Ethan's expression tightened instantly. "Who is that?" But I already knew, even before the knock came at the front door, because only one person still alive knew Richard kept backup records. And after all these years, she had finally come back. Gloria Bennett. The moment I opened the front door and saw Gloria Bennett standing on my porch, memories rushed through me so suddenly, I almost forgot how to breathe. She looked older, of course. We both did. Her once dark hair was now silver at the temples, and faint lines framed her sharp brown eyes. But Gloria still carried herself with the same quiet authority she had 30 years earlier, when she and Richard worked together on legal investigations across Cleveland. She held a leather briefcase tightly beneath one arm, while snow gathered on the shoulders of her coat. "Victoria?" she said softly. Something in her voice told me immediately this was serious. Very serious. I stepped aside quickly. "Come in." The moment Gloria entered the house, her eyes landed on Ethan sitting at the dining table beside Richard's files. She stopped walking. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then Gloria exhaled slowly. "So it's true," she murmured. Ethan stood awkwardly. "You knew my father." Gloria looked at him carefully, and something almost painful softened across her expression. "I knew him very well." She removed her gloves slowly while studying the open documents spread across the table. Then her gaze shifted toward me. "You opened the Lake Horizon files." It wasn't a question. I nodded once. Gloria closed her eyes briefly, like someone hearing an old nightmare return. "Oh, Richard," she whispered. Ethan glanced between us nervously. What exactly was my father involved in? Gloria looked at him for a long moment before answering. Trying to stop powerful people from destroying an entire section of this city. Silence settled heavily across the room. Gloria placed her briefcase carefully onto the table and opened it. Inside were additional folders, newspaper archives, and several old cassette tapes labeled with handwritten dates. My stomach tightened instantly. "You kept copies too," Richard insisted. Her voice remained low and serious. He thought something might happen to him. Ethan's face paled immediately. "What does that mean?" Gloria hesitated. Then she looked directly at him. "It means your father believed people connected to Lake Horizon were dangerous." The room went completely still. I felt cold all over suddenly. Because even after everything I'd learned, hearing the words spoken aloud made the threat feel real in a different way. Ethan shook his head slowly. "No," Logan's family are developers, not criminals. Gloria gave him a sad look. Those are not mutually exclusive. That sentence hit harder than shouting. Ethan sat down heavily again while Gloria carefully removed one document from her briefcase. Your father discovered something very important before he died, she explained. Lake Horizon was never primarily about housing development. What was it about then? I asked quietly. Control. She spread a city map across the dining table. Large sections of Cleveland's lakeside districts had been circled in red ink years earlier. These neighborhoods sit on some of the most valuable future commercial land in Ohio, Gloria continued. The redevelopment project allowed investors to quietly acquire property through shell companies before the market value exploded. Ethan stared at the map. But the city approved the project. Yes, Gloria replied coldly. Because politicians were paid to approve it. A terrible silence followed. Then she pointed directly at one marked section. My house, or more specifically the property beneath it. This parcel is the final unresolved ownership barrier. Ethan frowned. What does that mean? Gloria looked directly at him. It means without your mother's legal consent, several critical expansion permits remain invalid. My chest tightened. So Logan needs this property to complete the project. Not just Logan, Gloria corrected quietly. Multiple investors, banks, development firms. Ethan looked physically ill now, and they used me to get to her. Nobody answered, because we didn't need to. The truth was already sitting in front of him. Gloria carefully opened another folder. Richard uncovered evidence of illegal displacement tactics, hidden financial transfers, zoning manipulation, and bribery. Ethan stared downward. Oh my God, he planned to go public, Gloria continued softly. But shortly before filing everything officially, several witnesses disappeared. The room froze. I felt my heart begin pounding harder. Disappeared. Gloria nodded grimly. One moved overseas unexpectedly, another withdrew testimony overnight. A third refused all further contact. Fear spread slowly through me. Richard never told me that part. Maybe he was trying to protect me. Or maybe he became too frightened himself. Gloria lowered her voice. Toward the end, Richard became convinced someone was monitoring him. I remembered the late-night paranoia suddenly, with terrible clarity. The repeated lock checks. The curtains always closed. The strange cars outside. Dear God. Ethan looked shaken to his core now. You think my father was threatened? I think he was very close to exposing something extremely dangerous. I sat down slowly beside the table because my knees suddenly felt weak. For years, I believed Richard simply died exhausted and overworked from stress-related heart failure. Now, another horrifying possibility crept quietly into my mind. Gloria must have seen the fear on my face immediately. Victoria, she said carefully, I'm not saying Richard was killed, but she didn't sound certain either, and that terrified me more. Ethan stood abruptly and began pacing across the kitchen. No, he muttered repeatedly. No Logan would have told me if things were this serious. Gloria's expression hardened. People like Logan Whitmore tell useful people only what benefits them. Useful people. Ethan stopped moving. And I saw it happen again. That painful realization spreading through him deeper than before. He had never truly belonged beside those wealthy friends. He was simply convenient, educated enough to trust, desperate enough to manipulate, ashamed enough of his background to betray his own family. Gloria suddenly turned toward me sharply. Has anyone else seen these files? Only Ethan. And Logan? I don't think so. Good. The intensity in her voice startled me. She immediately began reorganizing documents quickly across the table. We need to secure everything. Ethan looked confused. Secure them from who? Gloria stared at him in disbelief. From the people currently panicking because evidence they thought was destroyed still exists. His face drained of color again. Then suddenly, his phone began vibrating repeatedly against the table. This time, it wasn't calls, messages, dozens of them. Logan, Vanessa, Derek, over and over. Ethan stared at the screen without touching it. Finally, another message appeared. Logan, we need to meet now. Then another. Logan, do not discuss this with anyone else. Gloria saw the messages too. Her expression darkened immediately. They know something changed. I looked toward Ethan. What did you tell them? Nothing, he answered quickly. I swear. Gloria nodded slowly. They're guessing. Then she leaned closer toward him. And trust me, Ethan. Wealthy people become very dangerous when billions of dollars are threatened. A chill swept through the room. Outside headlights suddenly moved slowly across the front windows. All three of us turned immediately. Another black SUV had parked across the street. Not moving, just waiting. Ethan stepped closer to the curtains carefully. That's Logan's driver. My heartbeat accelerated instantly. Gloria closed her briefcase sharply. They're watching the house now. Fear finally settled fully inside me then. Real fear. Not emotional fear, not heartbreak, actual danger. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I understood why Richard spent his final years looking over his shoulder. Because the people behind Lake Horizon were never planning to lose. The black SUV remained parked across the street for nearly 2 hours. It never moved, never turned off its headlights. It simply sat there beneath the falling snow, like a silent warning. Inside my house, nobody spoke much. Gloria organized Richard's files into smaller stacks, while Ethan paced nervously between the kitchen and living room, checking his phone every few minutes without responding to any messages. The atmosphere felt suffocating, heavy, like we were waiting for something terrible to happen. Around midnight, Gloria finally closed the last folder and looked directly at me. Victoria, these documents cannot stay here. I glanced toward the basement door instinctively. This house is the last place Richard kept copies, which means it's the first place they'll search if they become desperate. Her words sent a cold chill through me. Ethan stopped pacing. You think Logan would actually break into the house? Gloria gave him a sharp look. I think wealthy men protect billion-dollar projects the same way desperate men protect oxygen. Nobody answered after that. Because deep down, we all understood she was right. Gloria reached into her briefcase and removed several business cards. I still know people in federal investigation offices, she explained quietly. But before we contact anyone officially, we need leverage. What kind of leverage? I asked. Proof that they're actively trying to pressure or manipulate you. Ethan looked uncomfortable immediately. You already have financial evidence. Yes, Gloria replied calmly. But current behavior matters too, especially coercion involving property acquisition. I stared toward the SUV outside. So what happens now? Gloria's eyes hardened slightly. Now we let them panic. The sentence unsettled me. Because for the first time, I realized the balance of power had shifted. Logan thought he controlled everything when he walked into my house days earlier. He believed I was just an elderly widow with outdated furniture and limited money. Now he knew something terrifying instead. I had evidence capable of destroying people far richer than me. Suddenly, Ethan's phone rang again. Logan. This time, Gloria nodded toward him. Answer it. Ethan hesitated, then slowly pressed speakerphone. Logan's voice came through immediately sharp and tense. Where are you? At my mother's house. A dangerous pause followed. Alone, Ethan looked toward Gloria uncertainly. No. Another pause. Then Logan's tone changed instantly. Who else is there? I stepped closer before Ethan could answer. Good evening, Logan. Silence exploded across the line. For several seconds, nobody spoke at all. Then finally, Logan laughed softly. Well, he said carefully, this is unexpected. Is it? His voice became smoother again. I think we should all calm down before misunderstandings become bigger problems. Gloria rolled her eyes visibly beside me. I answered quietly. You mean before evidence becomes a bigger problem? Silence. Then Logan's tone cooled. What exactly do you think you found interesting? Not, what did you find? What do you think you found? Careful wording, lawyer wording. I think Richard Thomas was investigating financial corruption tied to Lake Horizon, I replied calmly. This time, Logan didn't answer immediately, and that silence told me more than any confession could. Finally, he spoke again, quieter now. Victoria. Powerful people are involved in this project. The warning beneath the sentence was unmistakable. I'm aware. You should also be aware that accusations can ruin lives. I almost laughed. They already have. Ethan closed his eyes briefly at my words. Logan sighed softly into the phone. Let's handle this privately. There is no private version of corruption. That irritated him. I heard it immediately. You're emotional right now? No, Gloria interrupted coldly. She's informed. Another silence followed. Then Logan's voice sharpened slightly. You must be Gloria Bennett. Her expression didn't change. And you must be exactly like your father. Something dark entered Logan's laugh then. My father built one of the largest development firms in the Midwest. Gloria answered instantly. On buried neighborhoods and stolen land? The line went dead. Ethan stared at the phone in horror. Oh, God. But Gloria looked almost satisfied. He's scared now. I folded my arms tightly. Scared people do dangerous things. Yes, Gloria agreed quietly, which is why tomorrow matters. I frowned slightly. What happens tomorrow? She looked directly at me. We forced them into the open. The next morning arrived gray and bitterly cold. I barely slept. Every sound outside made me tense. Every passing car felt suspicious. By sunrise, I had already made 3 cups of coffee and paced through every room in the house at least twice. Ethan looked terrible. Dark circles beneath his eyes, pale skin, trembling hands. Guilt ages people quickly. At 9:30 that morning, Gloria made several phone calls from my kitchen. She spoke carefully, professionally, avoiding details while arranging meetings with people I didn't recognize. Then shortly before noon, another car pulled into my driveway. Not an SUV this time, a sleek black sedan. Ethan immediately looked sick. Logan. Sure enough, moments later, Logan Whitmore stepped out wearing a dark overcoat and leather gloves. Vanessa Carter exited beside him, elegant as always, but visibly tense now. Derek Lawson followed last, carrying another thick folder beneath one arm. They looked different from the first night. Less arrogant, more urgent. I opened the front door before they knocked. Nobody smiled. Logan removed his gloves slowly. Victoria? Logan? Vanessa stepped forward carefully. We'd appreciate a conversation. You already had one. Derek cleared his throat awkwardly. This situation has become unnecessarily complicated. Gloria appeared behind me immediately. Funny, she said coldly. That's exactly what corrupt lawyers say before indictments. Derek's face tightened instantly. The tension became immediate and unbearable. Finally, Logan spoke again. We're willing to revise the property offer substantially. There it was. Straight to business. No pretending anymore. I stepped aside silently and allowed them inside. The moment Logan entered the dining room and saw Richard's files spread across the table, the color drained slightly from his face despite his effort to remain calm. He recognized the documents instantly. Interesting. Very interesting. Vanessa looked shaken too. Only Derek attempted to maintain composure. Logan slowly sat down across from me. "What exactly do you want?" The question surprised me, not because he asked it, because he sounded desperate asking it. I looked directly at him. The truth. His jaw tightened. "You're naive if you think truth changes anything." "No," I replied softly. "I'm old enough to know lies eventually destroy everyone involved." Vanessa suddenly leaned forward. "Victoria, please understand projects at this level involve complex financial structures." Gloria laughed sharply. "That's a beautiful way to say money laundering." Vanessa immediately fell silent. Derek opened his folder quickly. "We can offer full financial protection," he said carefully. "New housing, lifetime compensation, legal immunity from any project liability." Ethan stared at him. Legal immunity. Derek realized his mistake too late. The room went still again, because innocent projects don't discuss immunity. Logan shot Derek an irritated glance. Then finally, Logan looked directly at me. What would make this disappear? Such an ugly sentence. So simple, so revealing. Not prove us wrong, not explain the misunderstanding. Disappear. I slowly reached into Richard's folder and removed one photograph. An old image showing hidden financial transfers connected to Whitmore Holdings. Then another. Then another. With every document placed onto the table, Logan's confidence faded further. Vanessa stopped breathing normally. Derek's hands visibly trembled. And suddenly, the same people who once laughed at my old kitchen and worn furniture no longer looked powerful at all. They looked terrified. The fear in their faces changed everything. Just days earlier, Logan Whitmore sat in my dining room smirking at my curtains and outdated furniture. Vanessa Carter smiled politely while secretly mocking my life. Derek Lawson questioned my property like a man examining cheap merchandise at an auction. Now none of them looked superior anymore. Now they looked trapped. Logan stared at the documents spread across my dining table, his calm expression slowly cracking beneath pressure. Vanessa's hands were clasped tightly together in her lap, her expensive rings trembling slightly beneath the light. Derek kept swallowing nervously while avoiding eye contact with Gloria. And Ethan? My son looked horrified, not just by the evidence, but by the realization that the people he admired were falling apart in front of him. I sat quietly at the head of the table while snow drifted outside the windows behind me. For the first time in years, I no longer felt small in my own home. Logan picked up one photograph carefully. "Where did Richard get these?" I answered calmly. "From people who trusted him." His jaw tightened immediately. "Some of these files are confidential financial records." "Funny," Gloria replied coldly. "That's usually what criminals say when evidence surfaces." Vanessa suddenly leaned forward. "Victoria, please. This doesn't have to become public." There it was. Not denial, not innocence. Fear. Real fear. I looked directly at her. "You laughed at me in this house." Her eyes widened slightly. "I didn't. You treated me like I was worthless because I wasn't wealthy." Silence. Vanessa lowered her eyes, because she knew it was true. Logan suddenly stood. Enough emotional nonsense. His voice had lost all charm now. Only anger remained. "You have no idea what happens if these records are released." Gloria crossed her arms. "Enlighten us." Logan looked directly at me. Banks collapse, investors panic, thousands of jobs disappear overnight. I almost admired the manipulation. Turn corruption into economic responsibility. Turn greed into public service. Richard once warned me wealthy men often hide cruelty behind polished language. Now, I was seeing it myself. I folded my hands calmly. How many families lost homes during your acquisitions? Logan's silence lasted too long. Then Derek answered carefully instead. Redevelopment always creates displacement. Gloria laughed sharply. Displacement. That's a lovely corporate word for destroying neighborhoods. Derek's face reddened immediately. Ethan stared at the table quietly, shame spreading across his expression with every passing minute. Then Logan tried a different approach. We can resolve this privately. I looked at him carefully. How his eyes sharpened slightly. We increased the offer significantly. Enough for you to live comfortably for the rest of your life. The room went still, and suddenly I understood something important. Logan still believed everyone had a price. Even now? Especially now. I almost felt sorry for him. Because people raised around wealth often cannot imagine integrity existing beyond money. You think this is about a payout? I asked softly. I think everyone eventually chooses self-interest. I stared at him for several long seconds, then quietly answered, My husband died protecting people from men who think like that. Something dangerous flashed briefly across Logan's face. Impatience, maybe even panic. He leaned closer across the table. Victoria, let me be very honest with you. Gloria immediately stiffened beside me. That would certainly be refreshing, she muttered. Logan ignored her. You release these documents, powerful people will come after everyone connected to this situation. His eyes shifted toward Ethan. Including your son. The room froze instantly. Ethan looked up sharply. There it is, Gloria said quietly. The threat finally exposed itself completely. Logan sighed heavily. It's not a threat. Yes, I replied softly. It is. For a moment, nobody moved. Then suddenly Vanessa spoke, her voice shaking slightly. Logan, stop. He turned toward her irritably. We're past polite conversation. That sentence changed everything. Because now, even Vanessa looked frightened of him. I noticed Derek loosening his tie again, sweat visible near his collar despite the cold house. His polished confidence had disappeared entirely. Interesting. Very interesting. Gloria slowly slid another document across the table toward them. An account summary. Multiple hidden transfers connected to offshore development entities. Derek's face immediately drained of color. Oh my God. I looked directly at him. You recognize it? He swallowed hard before answering. That account was supposed to be closed years ago. The room became silent again. Then Ethan finally spoke. What does that mean? Nobody answered immediately, so Gloria answered for them. It means your wealthy friends lied to you. Logan slammed his hand against the table suddenly. Enough. The sharp sound startled everyone. For a brief second, his polished mask disappeared completely. Now he looked exactly like what he truly was, a frightened man losing control. You think exposing this makes you heroes? He snapped. You have no idea how large this project really is. Gloria remained calm. We know enough. No, Logan hissed. You don't. His eyes moved toward me again. Victoria, people above my father are involved now. A cold chill spread through my chest. Above my father, meaning Whitmore Holdings wasn't even the highest level. Vanessa suddenly stood too. Logan, but he kept going. Politicians, investment firms, federal contracts. Even Derek looked nervous hearing him speak openly now. You should stop talking, Derek whispered urgently. But panic was finally overtaking Logan's discipline. If these records surface publicly, people far more dangerous than us will intervene. Us. Not me. Not misunderstandings. Us. The confession hung heavily in the air. Ethan looked sick. You knew, he whispered. Logan turned sharply toward him. Of course I knew. The honesty stunned everyone. You used me, Ethan said weakly. Logan laughed bitterly. You wanted money and status. Don't act innocent now. The cruelty of the sentence landed hard, because it was true. Ethan flinched visibly, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw my son fully understand the kind of world he desperately wanted to belong to. A world where loyalty only exists until profit disappears. Vanessa rubbed trembling hands together. We need damage control. Gloria smiled coldly. That's difficult when evidence exists in multiple locations. All three of them looked at her sharply. Logan narrowed his eyes. Multiple locations. She leaned back calmly. Richard Thomas was smarter than you thought. That sentence terrified them more than anything else so far, because suddenly they realized destroying one folder wouldn't solve their problem anymore. They weren't fighting an elderly widow. They were fighting years of preparation left behind by a man they underestimated. Derek stood abruptly. We should leave. Logan didn't move immediately. Instead, he stared directly at me. And for the first time since meeting him, I saw desperation behind his eyes. Not arrogance, not superiority. Fear. Real fear. Then finally, quietly, he asked, What do you want from us? I looked around my small dining room. The same room they mocked days earlier. The same room where they laughed at my life. And now, here they sat, terrified of the woman they once considered powerless. I thought about Richard. About sacrificed neighborhoods. About my son losing himself, chasing acceptance from people who never respected him. Then I answered softly, I want the truth exposed. Vanessa closed her eyes. Derek cursed under his breath. And Logan Whitmore, for the very first time, actually looked defeated. After Logan and the others left my house that afternoon, the silence felt heavier than ever before. Not peaceful, broken. The front door had barely closed behind them before Ethan sank into the dining chair like his legs could no longer support him. His face looked pale beneath the kitchen light, and for the first time since he arrived in Cleveland, there was no arrogance left in him at all. Only shock. Gloria quietly gathered several files into her briefcase while watching him carefully. He'll turn on you first, she said calmly. Ethan looked up weakly. What, Logan? Gloria's voice remained cold and practical. When powerful people panic, they protect themselves. You're the easiest person to sacrifice. Ethan shook his head automatically. No. But even he didn't sound convinced anymore. Gloria continued organizing documents. You signed financial authorizations. Your name appears in project communications. You handled property outreach. Every sentence made Ethan look worse. Then finally, Gloria said the part none of us wanted to admit. You're disposable to them. The word landed brutally inside the room. Disposable. I watched my son lower his head slowly into his hands, and despite everything, despite the lies, despite the humiliation, despite the betrayal, my heart still hurt for him. That's the terrible thing about motherhood. Pain doesn't erase love. Sometimes it deepens it. Gloria closed her briefcase and looked toward me. I'll contact federal investigators tonight. I nodded quietly. Then she turned toward Ethan. You should hire independent legal representation immediately. His eyes widened. You really think it's that bad? Gloria stared at him in disbelief. Ethan, Your wealthy friends walked into this house today looking terrified. What does that tell you? He said nothing, because finally he understood. After Gloria left, darkness slowly settled across the neighborhood again. Snow still covered the streets outside, untouched and silent beneath the streetlights. Inside the house, neither Ethan nor I moved much for a long time. Eventually, I stood and reheated leftover pot roast from the night everything began. The irony almost hurt. I carried 2 plates to the table quietly. Ethan looked surprised. You made me dinner? I sat across from him slowly. You're still my son. That nearly broke him. I saw tears gather instantly in his eyes before he looked away. For several minutes, we ate in silence. Then finally, Ethan whispered, I'm sorry. The words were soft, fragile, but they weren't enough. Not yet. I set down my fork carefully. What exactly are you sorry for? He swallowed hard. For all of it? No, I said quietly. Be specific. His face tightened painfully. Because real accountability requires detail, not vague regret. He stared down at his plate. I'm sorry I let them disrespect you. I remained silent. I'm sorry I acted ashamed of you. Still silent. Tears finally slid down his face then, and suddenly he no longer looked like a polished finance executive. He looked like the little boy who used to cry after nightmares. I'm sorry I forgot who you and Dad were. That one hit me hardest. Because that was the real tragedy beneath everything. Not money, not corruption, forgetfulness. Ethan had spent so many years chasing acceptance from wealthy people that he slowly erased the parents who sacrificed everything for him. I looked toward Richard's photograph hanging in the hallway. Your son is finally seeing it, I thought silently. But the damage remained. Deep damage. You laughed at me, I whispered. Ethan closed his eyes immediately. I know. You sat in this house and let strangers treat me like I was worthless. His breathing became shaky. I know. You used me. That one shattered him completely. I didn't think. He whispered weakly. That's the problem. The room fell silent again. Then suddenly, Ethan stood and walked toward the kitchen window, staring out into the snow-covered street. I thought success would finally make people respect me, he admitted quietly. His voice sounded broken now. Growing up, poor always felt like carrying something ugly around. I listened without interrupting. In college, everyone else already knew how rich people talked, dressed, networked. He laughed bitterly. I spent years pretending I belonged. He turned toward me slowly, and Logan made it seem possible. Of course he did. Predators always recognize insecurity quickly. He treated me like family at first, Ethan continued. Invited me everywhere, introduced me to investors, told me I was smarter than everyone else in the office. Then his expression darkened, but every compliment came with conditions. I nodded slowly. That's not friendship. No, Ethan whispered. It wasn't. He sat back down heavily. I ignored things because I didn't want to lose the life I thought I finally earned. The honesty in his voice hurt, because now I understood something painful too. Ethan didn't just want wealth. He wanted escape. Escape from shame. Escape from the fear of becoming his struggling parents. And somewhere along the way, he confused morality with weakness. Then his phone buzzed again. This time, his face drained of color immediately. What I asked softly. He turned the screen toward me. A news alert headline. Federal inquiry rumors emerge around Lake Horizon project. My pulse quickened. It's starting. Ethan looked terrified. Then another message appeared immediately beneath it. From Logan. Call me now or this becomes your problem. I stared at the words. Not our problem, your problem. Exactly like Gloria predicted. Ethan answered the call slowly with trembling hands. I could hear Logan shouting the moment the line connected. What did you do? I didn't leak anything. You were at the house with those files. So were you. Listen carefully, Logan snapped. If investigators come asking questions, you handled community acquisitions independently. Ethan's face changed instantly. What you signed the outreach paperwork. Cold horror spread through the room. They're going to blame me, Ethan whispered. Logan's voice became icy. You wanted success. This is how high-level business works. The cruelty of the sentence stunned even me. Ethan looked physically sick. You said we were partners. No, Logan replied coldly. I said you were useful. Then the line disconnected. The silence afterward felt devastating. Ethan stared at the phone in disbelief, like he still couldn't fully accept reality. Then suddenly he broke. Completely. He dropped the phone onto the table and covered his face, while sobs shook through his entire body. Real sobs. The kind grown men try desperately to hide. I ruined everything, he choked out. My heart cracked hearing it. Because despite all the pain between us, he was still my child. I moved slowly beside him and placed one hand gently on his shoulder. For several seconds, he just cried. Years of pressure, shame, fear, guilt, all collapsing at once. I thought money would fix how small I felt, he whispered through tears. I closed my eyes briefly. Oh, Ethan. He looked up at me finally. What do I do now? That question mattered, because this was the moment everything could still change. Not legally, morally. I looked directly into my son's eyes and quietly answered, You tell the truth. The truth moved faster than any of us expected. Within 48 hours, federal investigators officially opened inquiries into the Lake Horizon redevelopment project. News stations across Ohio began covering leaked financial records, suspicious zoning approvals, and hidden investment structures tied to Whitmore Holdings. And suddenly, the powerful people who once acted untouchable began collapsing publicly. I sat in my living room one gray morning watching television coverage while snow melted slowly outside the windows. Reporters stood outside corporate offices downtown. Protesters gathered near redevelopment zones. Former residents spoke emotionally about being pressured to leave their homes years earlier. Richard had tried to warn people. Now the world was finally listening. Ethan sat quietly beside me on the couch, looking hollow and exhausted. He barely slept anymore. Every few hours, another attorney called him. Investigators requested interviews. Financial analysts reviewed project accounts connected to his department. But unlike before, he stopped hiding. The night after our conversation in the kitchen, Ethan agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. Gloria arranged independent legal counsel immediately, and together, they prepared statements documenting internal pressure from Logan Whitmore and senior project executives. It didn't erase Ethan's mistakes, but it stopped him from sinking deeper into them. That mattered. The hardest part came 3 days later. Logan was arrested publicly outside a downtown investment office. I saw the footage live on television. Reporters shouted questions while federal agents escorted him through flashing cameras. For the first time since meeting him, Logan Whitmore looked exactly what he truly was beneath the expensive suits and polished confidence afraid. Vanessa Carter resigned from her firm before investigators subpoenaed internal communications. Derek Lawson's law license was suspended pending review of legal misconduct connected to manipulated property contracts. One by one, their perfect lives cracked open. And all I could think was this. They laughed at my old house because they mistook simplicity for weakness. They never understood that some people survive with clean souls while others rot inside million-dollar offices. Still, none of it felt satisfying the way I expected, because beneath every news headline sat one painful truth. My son had nearly destroyed himself trying to belong to their world. One afternoon, Gloria arrived carrying fresh documents and legal updates. She looked tired, but calmer than before. "It's spreading nationally now," she said, while removing her gloves. Ethan sat at the dining table reviewing statements with his attorney earlier that morning. Dark circles framed his eyes permanently now. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly. Gloria exhaled slowly. "Bad enough that several investors are already cooperating." She placed another folder onto the table. "Whitmore Holdings is collapsing." Ethan stared downward silently. No victory crossed his face, only grief. Because once admiration dies, all that remains is the shame of having admired the wrong people. Gloria looked toward me. "Investigators are extremely interested in Richard's files." I glanced toward the basement door instinctively. It still felt surreal that my husband's forgotten work had become the center of a federal investigation years after his death. He knew I whispered quietly. Gloria nodded. "Yes." Tears burned unexpectedly behind my eyes. Richard spent his final years exhausted, anxious, and misunderstood. Even Ethan once believed his father simply failed in life because he never became wealthy. Now the truth stood exposed publicly for everyone to see. Richard Thomas had been right all along. That realization hurt and healed me at the same time. Then suddenly Ethan spoke. "I need to tell you something." His voice sounded fragile. Gloria quietly sat down across from him. Ethan stared at his hands for several long seconds before continuing. "Logan's father contacted me this morning." The room instantly tightened. "What did he want?" Gloria asked sharply. "He offered me protection." I frowned. Protection from what? Ethan looked up slowly. Being blamed publicly. Silence settled heavily. Then Ethan continued quietly. "He said if I claimed the acquisition strategies were my independent initiative, they'd make sure I avoided prison." Cold anger moved through me immediately. "They wanted you to take the fall." He nodded weakly. Gloria wasn't surprised. "Standard damage containment." Ethan laughed bitterly. "I spent years trying to become one of them." His eyes filled slowly with tears again. "And the second things became dangerous. They handed me to the wolves." I moved closer and sat beside him carefully. Some people only understand loyalty when they lose it. He looked at me painfully. "I don't deserve your kindness after what I did." That sentence broke my heart more than anything else. Because finally, my son understood the depth of his betrayal. I reached for his hand slowly. "Accountability matters," I said softly, "but so does redemption." He lowered his head, immediately crying quietly. And for the first time in years, I held my son while he allowed himself to be vulnerable again. Not successful, not impressive, not wealthy, just human. Later that evening, after Gloria left, Ethan and I sat together in the kitchen drinking coffee, while the local news replayed another Lake Horizon update. This time, reporters discussed criminal investigations connected to displaced families and falsified zoning approvals. Then one sentence caught my attention. "Authorities credit late attorney Richard Thomas for preserving evidence central to the investigation." I covered my mouth immediately. Ethan stared silently at the television, then quietly whispered, "I was ashamed of the wrong man." The pain in his voice felt unbearable. I reached toward the remote and muted the television. Your father never cared about being rich, I said softly. Ethan nodded slowly. I know that now. We sat in silence for a while after that. Then, Ethan finally asked the question he'd been carrying for days. Do you think Dad would forgive me? Tears filled my eyes instantly. Because Richard loved Ethan more fiercely than anything in this world. He'd be heartbroken, I answered honestly. Ethan lowered his head. But I continued gently, he'd also want you to become better instead of destroyed. That made Ethan cry harder than before. And suddenly, I understood something important about motherhood. Forgiveness is not pretending pain never happened. It's choosing not to let pain become the end of the story. Over the following weeks, investigations expanded rapidly. Multiple executives resigned. Several hidden financial networks connected to Lake Horizon were exposed publicly. Federal authorities froze development assets tied to illegal acquisitions. And through all of it, I stayed in my small house in Cleveland. The same house they mocked. The same kitchen where wealthy people once laughed at my life. Now reporters occasionally parked outside asking for interviews. Neighbors brought casseroles and flowers. Former residents from affected neighborhoods wrote letters thanking Richard for trying to protect them years earlier. But the moment I remember most clearly happened quietly one evening near sunset. Ethan stood alone in the backyard, staring across the snow-covered garden Richard once cared for every spring. No expensive coat, no polished confidence, no wealthy friends, just my son, lost and rebuilding himself from the ruins of pride. He turned toward me slowly, and in a voice filled with regret, humility, and pain, he finally said the words I had waited years to hear. You and Dad were never the people I should have escaped from. Spring arrived slowly in Cleveland that year. After months of snow investigations, court hearings, and painful truths, the first warm breeze felt almost unreal against my skin. Tiny green buds began appearing on the trees outside my house, and for the first time in a very long while, the neighborhood felt alive again. So did I. The Lake Horizon scandal eventually became one of the largest redevelopment corruption cases in Ohio history. Several executives accepted plea deals. Hidden financial networks collapsed publicly. Whitmore Holdings lost millions in frozen assets, and Logan Whitmore's father disappeared from public life entirely after multiple federal charges were filed. Vanessa Carter quietly left the country for several months after losing major business contracts and investor backing. Derek Lawson never recovered professionally after his legal suspension became permanent. And Logan himself, the young man who once sat at my dining table mocking my home, eventually agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for reduced sentencing recommendations. Funny how quickly arrogance disappears when prison enters the conversation. But despite all the headlines, interviews, and investigations, none of those outcomes stayed with me the most. What stayed with me was my son. Because real healing does not happen in courtrooms. It happens quietly, painfully, one honest moment at a time. Ethan moved back to Cleveland temporarily after resigning from his finance position in Chicago. At first, he barely spoke during meals. Shame followed him everywhere like a shadow. Sometimes I caught him staring silently at old family photographs for long stretches of time, especially the ones with Richard. One rainy afternoon in April, I found Ethan sitting alone in the basement, surrounded by his father's old boxes. He held Richard's worn leather briefcase carefully in his lap. I used to think Dad looked weak carrying this thing, he admitted quietly when he noticed me standing nearby. I leaned against the basement doorway silently. He never cared what people thought of him. Ethan nodded slowly. That used to embarrass me. His voice cracked slightly. Now, I think it was courage. The honesty in his words hurt and healed me at the same time. Over the following weeks, Ethan changed in small ways first. He stopped wearing expensive watches, stopped checking financial news obsessively, stopped speaking like every conversation was a business negotiation. One Saturday morning, I walked into the kitchen and nearly burst into tears when I found him repairing the broken porch railing Richard never had time to finish before his death. "I watched Dad do this once," Ethan said awkwardly. The railing leaned crooked afterward, but I still thought it was beautiful. Healing rarely arrives perfectly. It arrives honestly. A month later, Ethan asked if he could accompany me to the community library. At first, I assumed he was simply being polite. Then I watched him spend 3 hours helping elderly visitors carry books, organizing donated supplies, and fixing old computers for children in the reading room. Nobody there recognized him from the news, and for the first time in years, I think Ethan experienced what genuine respect feels like. Not admiration purchased through wealth, respect earned quietly through kindness. That evening, we sat together on the back porch watching the sunset spread orange across the neighborhood rooftops. After a long silence, Ethan finally spoke. "I spent half my life trying not to become you and Dad." The words could have hurt, but his voice carried no cruelty anymore. Only regret. "I thought money meant safety," he continued quietly. "I thought rich people mattered more." I looked toward the small garden Richard once planted every spring. "Healing people matters more," I said softly. Ethan lowered his eyes. "You and Dad already knew that." For the first time in many years, peace settled gently between us. Not complete peace. Some wounds never disappear entirely. There were still moments when memories hurt unexpectedly. Certain sentences Ethan once said still echoed painfully in quiet rooms. Some betrayals leave permanent scars even after forgiveness arrives. But forgiveness did arrive. Slowly. Not because Ethan deserved instant absolution, but because bitterness would have destroyed both of us eventually. One morning in early summer, Gloria visited with surprising news. The city approved a compensation settlement fund connected to displaced Lake Horizon residents. Several properties wrongfully pressured into redevelopment acquisitions would receive financial restitution. Then Gloria smiled toward me. "And there's something else." She slid another document across my kitchen table. A proposal. I frowned slightly while reading it. "What is this?" Gloria leaned back calmly. "A nonprofit initiative." Ethan looked confused too. Gloria smiled softly. "Victoria Thomas Foundation for Senior Housing Protection." I stared at the page in shock. The proposal outlined legal assistance, financial counseling, and advocacy support for elderly homeowners vulnerable to predatory property developers and financial manipulation. Tears immediately filled my eyes. Gloria. Richard would have wanted something good to come from all this. I looked toward Ethan. He smiled weakly. "It should have your name." That was the moment I realized my son truly understood everything now. Not success, not status, purpose. Months earlier, Ethan brought wealthy friends into my home, believing my simple life was something shameful. Now, he finally understood the truth. There is nothing shameful about honesty. Nothing shameful about sacrifice. Nothing shameful about surviving with dignity. The truly shameful thing is gaining the world while losing your soul. That night, after Gloria left, Ethan and I sat together in the backyard beneath warm summer air, while fireflies flickered softly around the garden. "I'm still ashamed of what I became," he admitted quietly. I reached over and squeezed his hand gently. "Good." He looked surprised. I smiled sadly. People who stop feeling shame for hurting others become dangerous. He stared downward silently. Then, after a long pause, he whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me." Tears filled my eyes immediately, because there were moments I almost had. Moments the pain felt too deep. But motherhood is complicated that way. A mother's heart can break completely and still keep loving. I looked up toward the stars slowly appearing above Cleveland's darkening sky and thought about Richard, about sacrifice, about survival, about how easy it is for this world to convince people that wealth equals worth, and how dangerous that lie truly becomes. Then I looked at my son sitting beside me, finally humbled, finally honest, finally healing, and quietly realized something beautiful. Sometimes people lose themselves completely before they finally understand what really matters. And sometimes, love waits long enough to bring them home again. Money can build impressive lives, but it cannot build character. Real wealth is not measured by cars, business deals, or powerful friends. It is measured by integrity, kindness, loyalty, and the people who still stand beside you when everything falls apart. Never be ashamed of humble beginnings. Honest struggle is not failure. Some of the strongest people in this world are those who quietly sacrifice for the people they love without asking for recognition. And if someone makes you feel small because of your age, your home, your job, or your financial situation, remember this: people who truly matter never measure human worth through money. Sometimes the people society overlooks are carrying the deepest wisdom, strongest hearts, and greatest courage of all. If this story touched your heart, please like and subscribe to the channel. I'd truly love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you loved or been judged because of your financial situation or background? And wherever you're watching from tonight, tell me your city and local time. I always love seeing where our little community is gathering from around the world.